Welcome. You're listening to the Good Girls Don't podcast with Ashley Ray
and Verity Mansfield.
This is the podcast where we smash those rules that we've been taught to follow both as men and women and burn the damn rule book. We're tackling the big issues and the issues nobody wants to talk about, and we'll be fiercely feminist about it.
This podcast is about inspiration, education, compassion, and being the change that you need to see in this world. This podcast is for the trailblazers, the freedom fighters, and the soul igniters, and all the women just like you who are ready to break the good girl rules and be heard.
We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and its First Nations people on which this podcast is produced and consumed. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Get ready for the revolution. It's coming to you now. It's coming to you now. We're gonna sing it, revolution. And they'll never bring us down. No, they'll never bring us down.
Verity, it's time for another episode.
No.
I know, jump back, Jack. Who would have thunk it?
I know, we've had 2 glorious weeks off recording and just settling ourselves back in for a whole new 10 weeks worth of yummy goodness of conversation.
We have, and we today have an episode that we've actually been wanting to have since the beginning before we released our first episodes. We wanted to have some really great conversations about race and Indigenous people in Australia, but we haven't been able to have that until now.
Yes, we've been looking for the absolutely perfect person for us to have this conversation with, and we found that, wonderful human being in Louise O'Reilly. And Louise is a Warrwa-Noongar Aboriginal woman. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Based in Boorloo, Perth, Western Australia, on Wadjuk Country. And through her experiences with her experiences with identity and her personal journey of self-discovery, she realized, quite early on that society wasn't always accepting of who she was, of her identity, of her community or her culture. And Louise provides online courses to stimulate harmonious and inclusive change in the world where every global citizen can say, I am #free to be me. And that's her big picture goal. And for now, she's focused on cultural diversity and inclusivity of Aboriginal people and culture, which is so beautiful and I think so much needed in today's world.
1,000,000%. She's also a freelance writer for Amnesty International Australia. And because I don't know that, I don't know how she bends time to do this. So as
She
well
does
as
so much.
she does, as well as being that freelance writer, she's also a radio host for Aboriginal women's self-empowerment program called Yorgas Yarning, or Women Talking, on 100.9 FM Noongar Radio. She's also a committee member for Danjoo Koorliny. Again, I'm sorry if I mispronounce these. I've done my best. Aboriginal-led 10-year visionary conciliation plan for Boorloo, also Perth, which is hosted by the University of Western Australia's Social Impact Unit. On top of which, because you need more things to do, Louise also runs her own personal business, the Ascension Personal Development Academy. And we've got this beautiful quote from her that says, if you let her, Louise will show you how to use your words to create inclusion and how to make it ripple out into the world.
And it's been such an incredible conversation. Ashley and I were just in such deep reverence for Louise and for the conversation. And it's probably one of the first podcast interviews where you'll hear silence from me.
Yeah.
We were so caught up in listening to Louise, it all just went silent. It happened a few times and we all started laughing because we were all just looking at each other and no one was talking. It was so beautiful. It really, really was.
It was. And we got to talk about some really big stuff. And, of course, we like to smash taboos and myths on this podcast, but this was really about, I mean, we covered a lot of ground, but I think some of the biggest stuff was about like facilitating a beginning point of conversation. It,
Absolutely. And we also talked really a lot about creating that safe space. And I guess for, white Australians to not always be the ones to speak up for Aboriginal people, but to allow the space for Aboriginal people to be able to be their own voice on their own terms. And we spoke a lot as well about the difference between diversity and inclusivity, which was really, I think it's really important. And some, like, we link the two together all the time, but we don't actually realize that they're very separate things. And we also talked,
yes.
about this subconscious guilt we have of white privilege, which really does stop us from being able to reach out and, in our efforts to actually to solve racism and how we need to deal with that.
Yes, and the foundations of what makes up inclusive language, like where do you start in unpacking that concept, and why our intention to learn outweighs the fear of offending someone, because that holds us back so often in just asking our question, putting a hand up and saying, I'm curious, tell me more.
Yeah, especially because it is difficult conversations. It's so emotionally loaded, on both sides. It does stop us from coming together and having conversations, around, inclusivity of the Aboriginal people, and of, creating such a safer, more beautiful, richer culture where we're all a part of it. We all have so much to bring to the table.
We do. And we spoke really beautifully about why an acknowledgement of country needs to be embraced and honored and more widely practiced.
And accepted. Oh my goodness. Like, it's so incredibly beautiful. And just, it doesn't take away from anything. It just adds so much more to our culture and to our society. And we
Yes,
also spoke about the importance of having privilege, and why it is important to have privilege and what we can do with that privilege.
because it's a power and we can use it for good.
What's that Marvel saying? With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, I was going to go with Captain Planet there. Like, the power is yours.
Yes.
But look, this conversation was really big for both of us. We've been wanting to have it for over a year, and we waited and waited, and we found the right person. And unfortunately, this conversation is long overdue, but we're really proud to bring this to you now, and we hope that you will enjoy it and learn as much as we did. Welcome to the Good Girls Don't podcast, Louise O'Reilly. It is fabulous to finally have you here with us.
Yay, I'm so excited. I'm so grateful to be here.
Oh, we're so grateful to have you, because we have talked for such a long time about having, women of color more included on podcasts, and Ashley made this really sort of poignant point, a good year ago, that podcasts seem to be overrun by white people and white guests. And so we have for a very long time been aware of trying to find and connect with and talk to women of color, so that we can have a more whole conversation, and that things aren't just, like the white perspective on all of these different issues. And, so much conversation, I think, does get missed out, by not including, women of color or people of color. And so for us, I feel like it's such a gift that you are here, and that, you have, I mean, we've looked at the information that you've been able to offer in your own beautiful Facebook group, and I've led people, and people have joined there. And I just think it's so beautiful to be able to have this space, and this platform to sort of celebrate you and everything that you do and everything that you have to say, because it's missing. It's so missing in our society, and it's driving me as a white person absolutely bonkers. And it's also like, I'm raising two young girls, and the three of us all agree, like, where are these conversations? So thank you. And I know my daughters are going to listen to this as well.
Yay. Wow. That, what a beautiful way to look at it. And it's actually really interesting you're saying people of colour, because I am a part of a marginalised group, and I identify as a Warrwa-Noongar woman. So that's an Aboriginal woman who my lands are based here in Boorloo, which is Perth, and also on Wadjuk Country, which is near Derby in the Kimberleys. So that's my two maternal grandparents' lines. And it's really interesting because I'm almost in almost like a different kind of category of people of colour, because I identify as an Aboriginal woman, but yet my skin is very fair. I look like a white person, or what we say here, Wadjuk person, which is it's not an offensive way at all. It's just simply a way of saying a person who is not Aboriginal. So it's really interesting because my other heritage is a Scandinavian heritage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so my father's line is Scandinavian and my mother's line identifies as Aboriginal. So it's a really interesting mix, and people talk to me about my identity and the way I look, because I look the way I do, but within I feel that my identity is closer linked to my Aboriginal heritage. So it's a really a new conversation that it's not new as in it hasn't been before, but it's new as in it's new to being talked about in the public space. So thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's interesting what you were just saying. I remember being in high school, and this is 20 odd years ago, and we read a book called, I think it was called My Place or Sally's Place, and I think it was written by Sally Morgan. I'm honestly trying to grasp 20 years of information, of information from 20 years ago. And it was a book about being, I think I might have the wrong one. It was called The Fringe Dwellers. And it was literally about the, I guess, Aboriginal people who were living on the fringe. They weren't quite, they weren't deemed to be Aboriginal, but they weren't deemed to be white. And that struggle of finding an identity within the country, which I remember being 16 and reading this and feeling like my heart was breaking. Like there's this feeling of, well, where do you belong? And how does one reconcile that? Especially if there are grievances on both sides and there's animosity, and I can't even speak today, animosity on both sides. And then how does someone who identifies or who has part of both move through with such a beautiful sense of awareness and such a strong sense of self as you do? Like how did you have to navigate your identity in those circumstances? Or
Absolutely. And it is probably one of the biggest struggles I've ever gone through in my lifetime, is finding my place in not only within your family, within your community, but in the world as a whole. Where do we fit? Because I kind of looked around and there are these labels and these silos of this group is this and it looks like this and it behaves like this, and this group of people looks like this and this is what they believe in and this is what they do. So there was all these really defined specific silos of people who had the different labels, and I didn't fit into any of them. So I love my Aboriginal culture. I practice that culture, even though growing up I didn't even realize I was practicing it. It wasn't until I grew up I realized that I was, but I also am deeply involved in my Scandinavian side of culture as well. So it is a mix of things, and it becomes hard especially when you're so young. For me, the concept of my identity and giving myself ethnical labels really started when I was about 5 or 6 years old. So that is very, very young. And this was actually, I would say, pushed on me by adults and by people who had some authority in my world. So it was for things like, they would say, are you Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal? And I'd be like, well, I'm both. And they would say to me, you can't be both. And so that really got me in my mind. Well, first of all, I was saying, well, I'm Louise. That's who I am.
Yeah.
And so as a kid that young, that's what I thought. I was just like, well, I'm just Louise. That's just me. But then I had to start using these labels, which I think may start a little bit sooner for Aboriginal children, growing up in these predominantly westernized structures and systems. Is because they need to have some kind of identity and identify themselves as being not part of the group at a lot younger age. So the concept of identity is really, really deep and starts really, really early. And sometimes we just can't handle that kind of pressure, because you're asking a baby essentially to define who they are in the world. And that's a lot to ask.
Yeah, I see that on every form. Every single form I fill out, there's a question of, being Torres Strait Islander or Aboriginal. And it's sometimes I've read these forms and I'm like, for the place where this form is coming from, why does it matter? Like and that can be my ignorance of things, but there is just sometimes it's just kind of like, what does it matter what gender I'm putting on my form? Like, that doesn't help this institution in any way, shape or form. Or why do we have to put our race or our religion down on a form? It's like we're constantly being told by society, you have to fit into a group.
Yep, absolutely. And that is a hard thing, but what has actually come to me right now is I'm being actually pushed to give an acknowledgement. So if you wouldn't mind, is it okay if I give an acknowledgement of country?
Yes, we'd
Of
love
course.
that.
Beautiful, thank you. That I can just feel it saying, come on, you need to do this, you need to do this. So first of all, I'll just explain what an acknowledgement to country is and a welcome to country is, because there are so many people who just don't know what the difference is and who is allowed to do what one. So you have, in Aboriginal culture, you have a welcome to country, and those welcome to countries are only performed by the elders of that country. And it's basically welcoming people into their home. So our country, our land, our budja, as we say here, is our home. It's not just confined to your house and your yard, but it's the entire country, all the way to the borders of that particular country. In Australia, we have many, many Aboriginal countries, and we know those borders, those boundaries. Now, those same elders cannot go onto another country and offer a welcome to country. They only have the authority to do it within their own country, and it's such a beautiful thing. And it's not only a welcome as being respectful to say, we welcome you here into our home. It's also, I guess, a handout to say, please accept this invitation to come in here. Please accept this welcome, but please also be respectful while you are here. We are the authority in this land, and we are also asking the spirits, the good spirits of the land, to keep you safe while you're here too, and allow you passage into this space. So it's something really deep and really profound, and it's multi-leveled in what it's about. Now you have an acknowledgement of country, on the other hand, can be performed or said by anyone. This is basically just a statement to say you acknowledge that there are traditional custodians and ongoing custodians in this place. They are responsible to this land, they belong to this land, and you want to pay them respects for being in their place and in their home. And that's basically what it is. It is about showing a respect. So I'm not an elder, so I offer acknowledgements. I, Louise O'Reilly of the Warrwa-Noongar peoples, would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional and ongoing custodians of the lands and waters in the lands that I'm on. And I would also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands and waters that you are on too, and to all your listeners as well. I would like to pay respects to all the elders and the old people from the past, the present, and all the way through the rest of time, and thank them for everything they have done, everything they will be teaching me, and the opportunity to be able to share and learn and grow my knowledge and share my knowledge with my children and my children's children forever and ever.
Oh, I've got chills.
I can be a bit teary.
So all really the hairs on my arm and neck stand on end, and just all that felt good.
But it's so beautiful, and it really does feel like it's such a spiritual and what's the word? Connective, almost pledge to honouring each other. And I feel like that is just what has been missing in Australian history, since, Captain Cook and previous arrived. And it really is. I think it's a really, really beautiful and powerful statement. And when we started this podcast, I think one of the first things Ashley said to us that we needed, this acknowledgement to country and to acknowledge, the Aboriginal people for being on the land. And funny enough, Ashley was just saying earlier that, she's received, what was the word that you said? You've like cop flack or something for having it there.
That I personally haven't, but I'm aware of other big podcasters that have quite a large, substantial Australian audience who never had one and then introduced it, and they received quite a lot of like hate mail and trolling for including it, and people, like, their audience dropped off, and it was a bit of a mess for them. And I just think that's, personally for me, that's really sad that can happen, because it's podcasting,
and I
is
think
often
that's
a very
one of those
white
things
world
as well, where people do say that, there's not that much racism in Australia, and it's like, well, hang on a second, you're white, how would you know? Like, if you've never been on the receiving end of it, you can't then say that it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And we aren't built to take in all the information around us. We're only built to be able to bring in certain amounts of information, because we don't have the capacity in our brains or our minds to hold and to convert that meaningfully. So our subconscious might take it all in, but consciously we only pick up things that are important to us. And if racism isn't something that is really important to you, or something you haven't really experienced, that kind of discrimination, it's not something you'll pick up. And it's something that is hidden in plain sight. So sometimes it just needs someone to make you aware of these things that are happening, why they're happening, and the impacts are happening, and then it clicks something in you. Your consciousness then starts looking for the little things, and then you go, oh, yes. And something that is what I have been finding coming up, especially with the Black Lives Movement that's been really predominant around the world, I've had people say to me that racism didn't start until all the movement started, or that the movement is making people divide. Which is a really interesting concept, because from that person's perspective and experience in life so far, that is what is happening. But from my perspective, and definitely my community, Aboriginal community's perspective, is that no, it has been happening. You can just now see it. It's just been brought to your attention. It is not something that has been hidden. It's just, you don't see it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't have to feel bad about not seeing these things. In reality, that's a privilege to not see things. How good is that, to not have to experience those things? But when you do, what do you do from there? That's the thing. When you do start identifying and seeing, what do you do from there?
And I think that was one of the really beautiful things that I picked up from you, Louise. And I've been talking about this to my children in terms of white privilege, and you raise this really beautiful statement, because we often talk about white privilege, or we're a feminist podcast, we talk about male privilege and white male privilege. Um, but you had this really beautiful point of saying, privilege isn't something to feel shame or guilty for, but it does give us a platform to be able to then speak up for those people who can't speak up for themselves. And so my girls and I have been talking a lot about that lately, that we are white and we do have privileges that other people don't have. And therefore, it's not about feeling bad for it, but then how do we use our privilege to make the world a better place for other people?
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
love the way that you phrased that. When I heard it from you, I was just like, it was like a little light bulb moment of, oh, why hadn't I thought about, like, I had thought about it, but you just said it in such a beautiful way. I was like, oh, I need to teach my kids this.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, privilege is certainly something that you should not be ashamed of, or be guilty about, or feel bad for. Privilege is a beautiful thing to have, and don't deny that, because that would essentially be doing the same thing as what is happening with marginalised groups, with Aboriginal groups, is that you're feeling bad for what you're born with.
Yeah.
And that's just not okay. And so because I know that's not okay, I am not going to then support people with that same thing being born with a certain amount of privilege in a certain way they have no control over. I'm not going to then support them feeling bad for themselves, or bad about themselves, or feeling guilty about that. No way, because I know it's not okay to do that. I've experienced that, and I see my family and my friends and my community struggling to feel with those feelings of feeling bad about themselves because who they were born to be. It's an unusual thing. So what I talk about is, okay, let's celebrate that privilege and go, isn't it wonderful that you have that? But now understand that with that privilege has a huge amount of power and a huge amount of influence to change what society is and how we function and what is seen as normal. Because what's seen as normal is not equal and not fair to a huge amount of people in our community. And this isn't just Aboriginal people. This isn't just, these are all the marginalised people. And I don't say minority groups because it's not a minority. A majority of people belong to marginalised groups. It is a very small percentage of people who fit into that dominant culture, who are the most privileged in our society. And how is that okay? So even us as women sitting here, we belong to a marginalised group. Why is it okay that most people are born with less privilege? It just doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, when you do think of women as a marginalised group, yet they do make up the majority of the population. So it's such an incredible point to make. And I think this is something that comes up a lot where, and I can, from my experience as a white woman, of like, how do I help? How do I be part of the conversation? How do I help solve racism? But it's one of those things where that shame of the white privilege, I feel, does prevent us from being able to reach out, or being able to help heal that rift, or being able to create conversation, because there's there is guilt and there is shame at a subconscious level as well. And I think that's one of the reasons that really stops us from being able to be so much more inclusive than what we are. And so I think, and it's really helped me as well to flip it the other way around. If I talk about sexism, about getting rid of the shame for men so that they can be included in part of the conversation, and, we can co-create and heal, the rifts together.
Oh,
I can't
God,
remember where I was going
Verity.
with this.
Verity and Louise have just both blown my brain open.
But I do think, looking at the I guess the concepts of racism and sexism, it really is this idea about separating people out into separate groups and keeping them separate and not allowing the
Yeah,
conversations to come
absolutely.
together. And I've been really, there's two things I really want to talk about. There's, first of all, I've been really perplexed on trying to find, I guess Aboriginal cultural centres or, like when you're a mom, you can go and, book your kids into jungle gym, or you can go and take your kids to, go see some historical thing, or what's that little part? The Lewin comes into Perth, and you can go have a trip on the Lewin and go and experience all these different things. Or you can take them scuba diving, and they can go and not scuba diving, snorkeling. You can go and experience, life underwater and things like that. You can go to aquariums and museums, and it always kind of hits me that I don't find there's anywhere for me to take my children to teach them about Aboriginal culture or history. Like, where are the museums? Where are the cultural centres? And we did find one 2 weeks ago down south in Margaret River, and it's closed. It's been closed for 2 years. And it's like, how do we learn about, their relationship with the land and the amazing foods that are so different from, white Australian food. I don't even know if we actually even have white Australian food. It seems to be, steak and chips or something. But there's so much missing. And I've always felt, to be honest, a bit of jealousy where I don't have a culture. Australia Day is about getting drunk and watching fireworks. What possible element of culture is that?
Yeah.
Like barbecuing steak on a barbecue. It's not. There's something so missing in Australia, and I think if we could find a way of learning more and honouring more about Aboriginal, culture and history, and even like food and the beautiful stories that you have, I just feel we would have such an incredible, rich country that we would all feel some kind of spiritual roots to, so much more respect for our environment. And one of the things, I know I'm ranting, one of the things I got really angry about was when the bushfires happened earlier this year. And there was a big article published in the newspapers about how they had created this kind of first all Indigenous or Aboriginal firefighting team. And at the bottom of the article, they had to point out that this was going to help them from being unemployed and keep them out of crime. And I remember being so angry, and I was yelling at my partner, why? Why did they have to go ruin the article? Why did they have to bring this in? When we talk about all white male firefighter teams, do we bring in that some of them have been like convicted as pedophiles or have, done, white crime, white collar fraud or whatever else? Like, we don't talk about that stuff. I'm trying really hard not to swear. We don't bring in all of the dark, seedy details when we talk about an all-white team. But yet we have this incredible moment at the beginning of this year to honour the authority that Aboriginal people have on this land, the knowledge, the wisdom that we have never paid any attention to help fight these fires, to save our communities, and yet we had to go and completely and utterly disrespect them.
I love a woman on a soapbox.
I love my soapbox. I do love it.
You brought up so many different things there. I've actually had to take a note of some of the stuff to talk about. So the first thing you're talking about is like, how do people of privilege or of the dominant culture help marginalised groups or Aboriginal people and Aboriginal groups come and be more in that public space and be part of those conversations and have a seat at the table. So something I want to talk about there is that you don't need to, because Aboriginal people are autonomous beings. We have our own brains, we have our own thoughts, we have our own ideas, we have our own aspirations. We don't need help with anything. We're just like any other person. The problem is what it comes down to is the culture, the way the culture is built and the way the culture is set up, that there are people taking up so much space, and they are also taking up the space that they probably shouldn't be taking up. So it's when we have those conversations around the table, it's when they're having those Q&A sessions, it's when we're having the really important decision-making stuff, there are people who are taking up the space that an Aboriginal voice should be taking, should be having. And they are trying to speak on behalf of or for. I mean, we just have to look at all the previous Aboriginal Affairs ministers. They're speaking on behalf of Aboriginal people, yet they're not even Aboriginal.
Yeah.
It doesn't, they have no idea of the culture, the complexities, the spirituality, and the impacts of what any kind of political decision has on these communities. You just can't, because you're not born into it. You are not an expert. And no matter how many books you read and how many Aboriginal people you listen to, you will never be an expert in that. The only people who are experts in those fields are people who have those lived experiences. But people who have those lived experiences aren't getting the same kind of recognition or being acknowledged as having that amazing wisdom to be able to share what is really going on. And so we're just completely removed from the table. So what it's really about, from my perspective, is that to really identify what your space is, how much space you're taking up, and then going, oh, maybe this is a space I shouldn't be in. I mean, even now, there are so many businesses who are selling Aboriginal arts and foods and cultural items, and they're not even Aboriginal. Yes, there may be a demand for it, and that's a beautiful thing, because it shows an appreciation for our culture, but that doesn't mean you need to take up the space. You need to, as far as I'm concerned, that space needs to be left empty until someone in that culture is able to or ready to fill that space. And that is something that's kind of a cultural thing that we see. When we see like a gap in the market, something is wanted, we have this like need to we need to fill that, we need to fill that. Whereas sometimes, and certainly within my culture, there is a right time for everything. And a right time is not always right now.
Yeah.
So then you were talking a little bit about not being able to find those spaces where you can learn or experience the culture or understand it and things like that. Well, I believe part of that is because you've gone through first settlement, which is essentially Australia's first immigrants to travel here. And then you go through all those little bits and pieces that have happened. A lot of the really not so good stuff happened, and it's created a lot of trauma. And today we are still feeling the symptoms of a lot of that stuff, but we're also being oppressed directly, and we are experiencing new types of traumas even today. So I don't know if you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and your listeners have heard of it. So you've got these needs, right? And until you fulfill all those needs of, love and security and all those things, until they're fully met within you and in your family systems, you can't even comprehend or worry about trying to teach other people or share your culture with other people or anything outside of you, because you are just trying to survive from within. And even if a person in those families is doing quite well with those needs, we still have extended families who need our support, and we need to heal as families and as communities. So much of our energy goes into healing our communities. But then you have which is kind of, a lot of it is not really seen. That's behind closed doors stuff that we're doing and helping each other in our communities and our families. But then you have the wider community saying, we want to have culture, we want to learn, we want to do this. And it's a lot of pressure to have, because there is massive trauma that's happening, and people are trying to get through their trauma. But then there is this niggling on the side saying, teach me, tell me what to do. And it's really, really difficult to balance.
Wow. So if I can just interrupt you, it's kind of literally just like a white person then saying, hey, you need to do this on my time.
Yeah.
Instead of honouring the time that Aboriginal people need to meet their just basic needs of survival and safety.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really...
And we don't have that. I mean, you just have to look at the Closing the Gap report that's tabled every year, and it's actually getting worse. The gap between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people in our community is widening. It hasn't improved. So to me, that's a very telltale sign that what the government are trying to do, and what a lot of and even though it may be well-meaning, they literally have no idea what they're doing, because they're not the experts in the culture. We know what we need, but we don't have that space to do what we need to do to fix things, because we know how to fix things.
Yes, and I think there was something really beautiful that's just coming up when I've listened to you previously, and you talked about the Bringing Them Home report. And I don't think I'd ever heard of this report, and if I had heard of this report, it obviously just didn't hit my radar. And so I read it and I cried, and I read it to my kids and cried more. And it's really horrific. And when you actually read the stories in there, the accounts in there, it's just, it's so heartbreaking. And there was a really beautiful sentence that you said, which was that it was, I probably won't get this perfectly correct, but it was along the lines of, it is hard to share the trauma when we fear you won't understand.
Yeah.
And that literally hit me in the chest so hard, because we've all been in a position where we've been traumatized and we haven't been able to tell anyone because the fear of not being understood. And we need to have, I think that's why this conversation, even with you, because you're teaching us as you're talking, and I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I just did that. Oh yeah, I did it. But it's like, if we don't have this conversation, it is so hard for us to understand. It is so hard for us to find that compassion. If someone's not telling us, hey, make space, we don't know that we need to make space. And it must be such an incredible, I can't even imagine navigating what you're navigating, or any other Aboriginal person must be navigating with everything you've just said. One, they're trying to heal themselves. Two, they're being asked to be accountable to a community, like the communities in like a whole broad community. They've got white people banging on saying, hey, step up, talk with us, do this, do that. Hey, start these enterprises. Hey, you should do this. I can't, like, the overwhelm, it just sounds absolutely sort of crazy. And like you said, we have a government, and I think this is why I wanted to raise the Bringing Them Home report, where I think you touched on it, that they made a whole lot of recommendations in that report, and yet hardly, some of them have been met, but not a lot.
Yeah, I think there was about 52 recommendations in that, something like that, and only a handful of them have been met since it was first tabled.
Which is
a long time ago.
It's a long time to be doing nothing.
Yeah. So, and that builds that distrust between the Aboriginal community and government, because it's like, well, you have these inquiries and people go, this needs to be the big inquest into this, and we need to get consultants, and we need to find out what the issues are, and then we need to get the recommendations. But the thing is, it gets tabled and that's where it ends. And we know that. It's just literally, there's such a, I guess, romantic idea of putting something on paper, black and white, but not actually the doing afterwards. The doing afterwards never seems to happen. So that builds that real distrust with government and wanting to work with government or any type of authority or institution. So yeah, we're doing those healing things, and yeah, like you said, it is really hard to then try and deal with the pressure from the community to do all these things, and then you're slapped on with these things like, oh, they're lazy, they don't want to work, they don't want to do this, and they're not caring about their culture, they don't want to share it with us, all these different things that happen, but not realizing that not only do we do that healing kind of stuff in our communities, but we have this ecosystem of support for all the people in our community. And this is unpaid voluntary stuff. So if you want to know who are the best volunteers in the world, you know, go and have a look at Aboriginal people and how we do things. And that is, you know, from the grandparents are really great at teaching the young children, and the people who are a little bit older are the ones who go and do the labor kind of stuff and bring in money for the families and things like that. And then you have the elders, which provide the support for all and guide us and teach us things and teach us about culture. This is all unpaid stuff, but it happened. Yeah. But this is stuff that is behind the curtain, because why should anyone outside the culture have access to that? And that's not something we need to say, oh, well, we do this and we do that and we do this. So we just shouldn't have to go, well, we're not lazy because we do all these things, or we're not criminals because we do these things. It's none of your business. At the end of the day, it really isn't any of your business, because nobody pries into the lives of the dominant culture and saying, well, on the weekend, what do you do?
What are you doing? Yeah.
Are you sharing your culture? Are you trying to start an enterprise, or are you trying to support your community in some way? Nobody asks those questions. And because it's no one else's business.
Yeah.
It's just a really interesting concept of what is good for one is not good for the other kind of thing. And it's not equally done in an equal way or in a fair way at all.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that kind of reminds me of I don't know the correct terms for this, but I remember when you were doing this beautiful Facebook Live in your group, and you talked about this kind of, you know, privilege test, and you went through this whole series of questions, and I paused you to went to grab like pen and paper, and I was doing it, and there were things in there that I was just kind of like, oh, wow, like I didn't realize that, you know, I had access to medical treatment and other people in Australia wouldn't. Because in my head, you know, Medicare's like offers all these free services. And, you know, am I free to celebrate my culture? Well, I don't have culture. And even if I did, you know, yeah, I would be totally free to celebrate that. And yet other people would be shunned for it. Just as much as when the talks and marches were going on with the whole with Black Lives Matter over, I think it was in Sydney where they did the really big one, or was it
Melbourne as well?
Sydney. And I jumped on Facebook to watch it, and there were all of these people laughing. I mean, just laughing faces, laughing faces, laughing faces, laughing faces, and I had to turn it off because I couldn't stomach the racism. It was just like, oh my goodness, like how can people be so cruel? And how do we then say, well, we're not racist, but we're going to laugh at an Aboriginal person for speaking their truth? It's like, like it doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. It's very uncomfortable, and I will say it is very hard to turn up to a protest and to a rally, because you know what can happen, and you know that there may be people who are there as just as agitators to start things, and just overall I certainly don't feel safe. But that's where it's important to actually define that and go, look, people who don't feel safe to attend still do.
Yeah.
And there's a really big reason they're attending and going to that space where they don't feel safe. It's because it's so important. And the reason they don't feel safe is because there are people who are just, I don't know. I can't comprehend why some people would want to cause that kind of pain or go against it. I don't know why people would do that, especially when it doesn't really directly affect them in any way.
Yeah.
But it is uncomfortable to do that kind of stuff. But also I wanted to talk a little bit about, you said a couple of times that you don't really have a culture. And I find that really interesting. I say you do have culture. And I think, and something that I find very common is that if people do belong to that dominant culture, they don't actually know what their culture consists of. So people who are in the marginalised groups or marginalised cultures, they know exactly what their culture is because they've been required to define it over and over and over again. So in Australia, we definitely do have culture, and in our own families, we have culture. I mean, we live in homes, which are in yards that we can purchase or rent, and we have, communities of shires and councils, and they have their own governments. That's all part of culture. We can go out and eat, or we can cook our own food. We eat with knives and forks and plates at tables. For entertainment, we go, watch sports or we watch movies. They're all part of culture. So we all have culture, but it's hard to define when you've never had to.
That's so, I'm literally like digesting what you're saying.
I have a tendency of doing that to people.
Yeah, I've been doing that this whole time. My brain is like, this is amazing.
I think what I have seen growing up in terms of culture is my friends who, I had these beautiful Vietnamese friends, and they would get together with their families and cook all these amazing, beautiful Vietnamese foods, and they would have their specific celebrations. And then other friends who were Greek, and they would get together and they'd make their own pasta sauces, and they'd get together, and the whole family, like 70 of them, would get together and, create all of these homemade sausages and ferment them, and like there's all these beautiful, I think, incredibly connective, almost spiritual ways that these different groups of society have gone together and celebrated their unity.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really fascinating
that too.
as a white woman to sit here and think,
right? You have birthdays, you have Christmas, you have Easters, you have New Year's, you have, even if it's just like a family movie night, or you have sporting events. These are connecting spiritual things. It's just not labelled as that.
And I wonder if that's part of our white privilege, that it is so, well, doesn't everyone do that? And it's like, well, no.
No, not everyone does do that. Not at all.
I have to say, full disclosure, when I was younger, I dated a man from China, and I did not at the time, this was like when I was like 18, I did not understand that they had a completely different New Year celebration. And my brain was like, no, that doesn't work. I did not get it at all. So it's, yeah, I get what you're saying. It's like, yeah.
Yeah,
I see what you mean.
Even things like your seasons, is you have 4 seasons, right? That's part of culture. In the Noongar culture, we don't have 4 seasons. We have 6 seasons.
Oh, really? See, this is the fascinating stuff.
I heard in Melbourne, it's like 13 seasons or something. It's
I can
nuts.
believe that. Yeah,
it's Melbourne. It's weird.
But you know,
Yeah.
and then you look at things, and even in business, I know in business and even with women's menstrual cycles and that, they talk about the different seasons and what season you're in. So for Noongar people, we're always looking at what season we're in across the 6 seasons, and that goes from the very first season being Makaroo, which is about fertility. And then you go on to conception and to birth and to adolescence, and you go through, and it's similar like the moon cycles. So they're all part of culture. It's just that we identify them directly with culture and honor them as being part of our culture and part of who we are. Whereas when you belong to the dominant society, it's just this idea, like you said, that doesn't everyone do it? It's just, it's nothing because everyone does it. But that's just not the reality.
That's an
Wow.
incredible insight that my brain is still gonna need to.
I feel like my white privilege is definitely showing at the moment. But it's beautiful because it's like, oh my God, like it's this fascinating learning curve and kind of expanding that mind to be inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
It's gorgeous. It's all of this. Yeah, this is gonna take me, I think, a couple of weeks for this to soak in and integrate a bit, because like this is a conversation, like Verity said at the beginning, we've been wanting to have for a long time and wanting to find the right people to have this conversation with. We've had to wait like a year to find the right person, which is you, and it's amazing. Like I'm gushing a bit, but it's like I don't think we could have planned this any better if we tried like this.
Yay.
Just with what we're able to talk about and bringing it to light. Like there's so much that you've shared that I know is going to be just, I think it's going to blow people's brains
Yeah,
away.
it's so beautiful.
Well,
And
I hope so. And I mean, the thing that I talk a lot about is inclusiveness, and how can we co-create an inclusive world together, because it's becoming more and more apparent of how all people are not included in everything. Women included are not included in different things. So how can we go, okay, well, this is what's happening. Let's not feel bad about what is happening, but let's just go, okay, this is what is happening. And then step into our power and go, okay, what can I do with my privilege to influence some kind of change? Any kind of change. What is an area that I influence where I can kind of influence some form of inclusion? Now, diversity and inclusion are 2 separate words. This is something that people don't understand. You can have diversity in a space, but that doesn't mean it's inclusive. That just means there's lots of people from who identify differently in the same space. If you want to have diversity, there needs to be inclusion first. You need to have a safer space for them to be, then they will come. And they will not be required to be there. They will not be there only because this particular role is set for Aboriginal people or marginalised people or whatever. They will come willingly because it's inclusive. They are valued in that space. They are wanted and they are invited in that space. And when they speak, people listen.
we're listening.
Okay, I'm listening. We're listening. I saw, this reminds me very strongly, I saw something the other day that spoke directly to this, and it was, you know, diversity says, okay, like let's pretend it's a board meeting. Inclusivity says, has everyone had a chance to be heard at the table? Has everyone spoken their piece, had their idea heard? And diversity just asks who's in the room.
Yeah.
It's not about being heard.
Yeah, because a lot of the times we're invited to the table, but not invited to speak. It's a checkbox thing. Oh, there is someone here who represents Aboriginal community. Tick.
Check.
That's all that's required. There's no what is your perspective on this? Do you have any insights or nothing like that? So
yeah,
it is a backwards way of doing it. It needs to be, the culture of the spaces need to be transformed into something more inclusive first. Because it's not fair to ask people who are marginalised or who are identified differently to come into a space that's not safe for them. That's not fair. And that's what's happening across the continent, especially when they have, you know, these diversity goals that they want to have so many % of people identifying as this type of person, so many % identifying as this type of person. But yet you're saying, just come here. It's not safe for you to speak. You are not valued here. You're not respected. But just come in here so we can tick off this KPI, this key performance indicator, tick. Just so we can feel good, like we're doing something good for the community or for the company. And it's just not the case.
And nobody wants to feel like they're just a box to be ticked.
Nobody wants to be the token.
Yeah.
Who wants to be a token when you go there and you know you're not valued? They don't actually care about you, your thoughts, or who you are. They just want you to be there so they can say that they've done their thing and they feel like they're a better person.
Yeah, it's incredibly selfish.
Mm-hmm. It is.
It is incredibly selfish. And I think that came up a lot with the marches. It was something, oh my goodness, I can't remember what the lady's name is. There was a comment made with the Black Lives Matter marches that all these white people were turning up to show support, but how much of that was just pure ego of wanting to be seen like they were doing something, but then would go home and then
do nothing.
Or go home and not think about it again and just be like, yep, I turn up to the march, I'm an awesome human being. And then...
Yeah, and I would say to that, yes, it happens. But there's also a place for that. Sometimes the body count is what makes a difference.
Yeah.
To show that support, to change the culture.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I approve of it, but I'm saying that it still does hold value in that for the body count, or the, you know, in terms of signatures. And so they do count for things, especially in our government environment. But and that's why allyship is so incredibly important.
Definitely.
Because it is the difference in power, level of power and influence that you have when you have privilege. And so you have the power to be able to influence different things in ways that a lot of the Aboriginal community cannot. And so that is essentially, it's a commitment to those causes without feeling the need to want recognition or accolades or anything like that of it. It's the kind of thing that you want to help because you can see there's something not okay in your community, and you know that that not okayness directly impacts you and your family and our collective. So you want to be part of that. I don't like to say change, because I think people have such a fear with the word change or anything changing, but it's an innovation, it's progress, it's us evolving and expanding and growing together into something that includes more of us. It's into something that basically says it's okay for me to be me, for you to be you, if we have more inclusion. When we have these systems of exclusion, what it says is, if you don't fit into this little box, you're not okay. And that basically says almost everyone in Australia is not okay. And I reckon that is a load of, you know what, because everyone is perfect exactly the way they are, and they should feel valued, and they should feel like they mean something, and they should feel like exactly who they are is who they're meant to be, and that is perfect. And that's what an inclusive world brings.
I'm gonna pick.
I'm just sitting here. I'm like, so I've never been so quiet on a podcast, Louise.
This is Louise. That's no small boast. Verity is a talker. This is amazing.
I wondered whether your screens had frozen.
No, yeah, we weren't frozen. We were just mesmerised and just listening. And I think that's probably one of the beautiful things, Louise, is the fact that there are so many different perspectives to look at these things, and so many things that we need to just sit with and own and think about ourselves, and where we do sit with the uncomfortableness of racism in our country, and how we do choose to show up, or how we consciously choose not to show up, and that understanding that, you know, we are in this together, and it, I hope to God it progresses. I don't want to say that it will naturally progress. I because what you said before about the GAT report is really just weighs very heavy on me. But, you know, the little things that we can do, and I know this is something that you're also passionate about, is even just being really aware of our language and using inclusive language. So maybe where one individual can't feel that they can create massive change or massive progress by themselves, each one of us can be accountable for the language that we do use on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the inclusive language, or even just give us an example of what non-inclusive language looks like that we might not be aware of?
Yeah, sure. So, inclusive language, so the very foundation of it, the very basic, stripped down of everything, is basically saying at the beginning, we all belong to the same group. Every single person belongs to the same group, and that is people. And then after you identify that we all belong in that same group, then you can start to say, but in this group, we also have little segments in the group too. But that doesn't mean you don't belong in the group. It just means you form a different part in it. So you have your different identifiers, and that's where you feel your heart is most connected into different areas. But that doesn't automatically pop you out of the group, say, well, you're no longer in this group, you're actually separate now. It just means that it's a section within it. So some of the, so an example of exclusive language, or I guess negative term for Aboriginal people, is if you say Aboriginals. So that basically says that there is a group that is external to the larger people group. Whereas you say Aboriginal people, Aboriginal community, that still means they're part of that whole group. And this also applies to, you know, other marginalised groups. For instance, instead of saying autistic child, you can say a child with autism. So they're still part of the collective of children, but they've got this other identifier too. Or if someone uses a wheelchair, it's not wheelchair bound or something like that. It is a person who uses a wheelchair. Also, another one that was actually brought up to me, I was saying, you know, it's not a person with a mental illness, and I was corrected, and they say that actually brings a form of lack. So I'm still learning in this process too. What they've said to me was, they say it's a person with mental health challenges. So it is something to say that they're not any lesser than, they're not any worse than. It is just, we are all equal, and we have these little identifiers that help us connect with other people closer. So I hope that kind of explains what it is. If as long as you're saying they belong to the collective, and this is how they choose to identify, and not necessarily how a person chooses them to identify.
Yeah, and I think you also brought up this really incredible point that made me sit up and think was, like if you saw children playing outside and they kick the football across the road or something, this is probably isn't your example, but it's relates to it, that you know, if you were to say, oh, I saw some children kick a football across the road is one thing, but then to say I saw Aboriginal children kick a football across the road is kind of like, why would you bother why would you bother separating them out and pinning them to a group, and when that the use of the word Aboriginal in that sentence has got nothing to do with any of it. It's why point it out, why bring it up, why separate them out from all children.
Absolutely.
Compared to if you were saying, you know, there's racism between, you know, white Australians and Aboriginal people, then there's a point of saying the word, you know, Aboriginal in that sentence, because you're trying to actually, like, it's pointing to the point you're actually trying to make in a conversation.
Yeah.
And that really hit me as well, because I hear it so often, people using these labels when it's not necessary in the sentence, when it doesn't do anything for the sentence, it doesn't create a discussion in the sentence, but we just go around, you know, separating people out.
Yeah.
And it does stop us from being inclusive. Like, just the way that we use our language in that way
Yeah.
can...
Also, we've been conditioned to have associations with those particular ethnic groups.
Yes.
And so unconsciously what we can be doing is saying, here's a situation happening and there is this ethnic group part of that situation, which then brings in all the associations we've been conditioned to believe. And you will look at that situation with very different ideas and from a very different perspective once that ethnicity of that group is added to that. And quite often, if it's anything other than that dominant culture, there aren't great, it's not seen in very great lights, any other form of ethnicity. So I think it's been used particularly in the news media as a way of weaponizing situations and a way of demonizing people or groups of people and dehumanizing people as well. Because as humans, we care about each other and we don't want to see suffering or anything like that, because we know that we are one and we are a collective, regardless of whatever identifiers we have. But when you are conditioned to start dehumanizing certain groups of people, then suddenly you go, well, they must not have the same rights as me. They must not feel the same things as me. And they don't have, I guess, the same values that I do. Mm. That's because they're no longer equal to you. They're no longer as human as you. And so it's okay to start doing these bad things to these people, and it's okay to start treating them bad and things like that. And it takes away our human rights in those situations. And it makes it seem like it's okay. Even if it's not, it makes it seem and feel like it's okay. It like justifies, well, it's okay to do this because of that.
Yeah.
And that's a very slippery slope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really, really is. It's interesting because girls and I were just watching Jojo Rabbit the other night on TV, and I was saying to girls, okay, now just think about the movie again. And if we were talking about, if we replace, you know, the Jewish community with the Aboriginal community, and the girls are like, oh my God. And it's like, yeah, like it's so easy for us to look at something in the past and have all of this compassion, all of this understanding. But yet when it's like in our present, or it's not that far from the past, it's like no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really, really super hard to deal with, and to think right now there are people going through these really terrible times, and the systems that we're participating in are contributing to that. So that's a hard thing to take in. And, you know, when we talk about social innovation or progression or change, really it comes from within first. And so that's what I really encourage, that, you know, people don't have to be going, how am I going to change the world? How am I going to do this? Oh, this is too big. All you need to do is start from within and look at your own biases, look at your own associations to these different minority groups, and, you know, ask yourself, is this real? Is this true? Or, you know, you can really start to look at it and go, do these things that I believe about these people actually match up with my values? Because you'll often find they don't. They're not a match at all. And that's why there is such a uncomfortable, uneasy feeling about it, because you're actually going against your own philosophies. You're going against your own value system with these thoughts and beliefs. And that uncomfortability and that not feeling goodness is coming out. It's like, I don't want to deal with this. I need to get away from this situation as quickly as I can to get some relief from it. So a lot of the time, that allyship that I was talking about, is about just sitting there and being with that uncomfortability and just going, it's okay for me to feel uncomfortable. Why am I feeling uncomfortable? And can I do anything to not just leave the situation, but can I do anything to actually change the situation? And I completely understand when people have quite adverse reactions to learning these things. And I talk about language, and I really advise people not to call another person racist, even though that might be what it is, that might be what the behaviour that they're demonstrating is. But when you say things like that to people, they shut down. They no longer use their frontal cortex. They no longer use their capacity for reasoning and logic. They shut that off. They start using their amygdala, which is about their flight, fight, freeze, and appease. And there's no way that you're going to change their mind or have a decent conversation with them. What you're going to be doing is they're just going, you're attacking me. I need to stop this now.
Yeah.
So it's not about, I see a lot of people who are really pushing the social change movements and things like that, that saying, we have to make people uncomfortable. And I go, well, no, you don't have to make people uncomfortable, because if you make them uncomfortable, they won't come back for a second conversation.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Let's drop the little seeds. Let's have the conversations where they go, you know what, let me think about that, and let's come back and we'll have another chat. Allow them to go away, come back, have another little seed. It doesn't need to be harsh. It doesn't need to be hard. It just needs to be something respectful, because you need to give respect to also gain respect. And you have to understand, actually, I'll show you a little, I might not be able to. Oh, there it is. So I know if your podcast listeners won't be able to see this, but what I've got is I have a diagram, and it's of an iceberg in water. And there is a tip of the iceberg right at the top. And so that's what you would see, their visible behaviours of these people. But there is so much going on underneath the surface within these people. So you have things like their systems and structures that they unconsciously do. This is their unconscious stuff. So this is like driving a car or making a breakfast or brushing your teeth, all those things that are just happening. And the structures that they live in are the paradigms of what we're living in life at the moment. So these are the work structures, these are our government structures, all those kind of things. They are just seen as that's what is, and that's how it's meant to be. Underneath that, you have their values and belief systems. And so this, and also the paradigms of thought, are there too. And these things are the things that contribute to their personal philosophies and their identities. And so if you're saying to them that the things that they are doing, so mostly everyone tries to do the best they can, right? With what they have, they try to be a good person. They believe they're being a good person. But then someone comes to them going, the behavior you're doing right now is not really a great behavior. It's racist, and you're hurting people, and you are contributing to the oppressive systems, and it's not okay. So you're not okay. That means what's going on underneath, you're actually saying who they identify as and who all their philosophies are is not okay. So it's not just about saying your behavior is not okay. What you're actually saying is who you believe to be you, who you believe to be okay, is actually not okay in this system. So giving them space to process it in a really gentle way, to go, you know what, this belief and this behavior I'm doing actually doesn't match with my value. So my value is on equality. It doesn't match with that. Why doesn't it match with that? And allow them time to process that. Don't push until you get them to admit you're right, because it's not about being right. It's about winning. And winning is when we all win, when we're all included, when we're all valued, when we all are equal. That is winning for them, and it's winning for you.
Absolutely.
So it's such a deep thing to do. And that's why I also try to talk to my students about the way we approach these conversations and the way we have them, and to not push and not be harsh or mean, and things like that, because you really are trying to restructure or reform who a person is from the inside out.
That's a big job.
Yeah, it is.
Wow. Louise, this is, I actually don't have words. I mean, I'm
It's
just,
such an incredible
yeah.
conversation to have, and I just think it's just one that is so necessary and yet so beautiful. Yeah, and I'm just so grateful to be able to have this conversation. And Ashley and I've talked about having this conversation in our heads and in our conversations. We've always kind of said, oh, what if it goes the wrong way? What if, you know, someone offends the other one? What if we say the wrong thing? What if, you know, and, you know, this whole podcast is about having a platform to have a voice, not to be scared about having a voice. And like you said, to use the privilege that, you know, and we all have different privileges, but to use the privileges that we all have to step up and be the voice to make, you know, the world, our communities, our society a better place. And, you know, as we're talking about today, a more inclusive place.
Yep.
So it is such a absolute honor and pleasure and joy to have shared this space with you, and for you allowing us as well to be able to, I guess, co-create a space with you for this conversation.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you. Seriously, thank you. I am so unbelievably grateful for this opportunity to talk with you. It has been a beautiful conversation. And I want you to know that anything that you said, to me, I like to feel that I want to make others feel included. And I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable having these conversations with me, and not to be afraid to ask the question. So there are people out in the community who are willingly out in the public to have these conversations. So start following these people, listening to these people, connect with these people and ask them the questions. You know, with us, we bring all of our history, and we bring our experiences, we bring our philosophies, we bring so much stuff along with us. And quite often the people who are having these conversations don't mean to do any harm at all. And I think that intention is very important to recognize. But also the way I do things, the way I teach things, is to be really gentle with them and go, well, you know, maybe that's not the best way to say that, or maybe think about it in this way, but not to jump on people and go, you shouldn't have said that. That's not okay to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, I find a gentle firmness is really good, because then it allows people that feeling of safeness to ask the questions they're afraid to ask other people. And until we ask those questions and have those conversations, things are not going to start changing, because we're just going to keep living the way we've been living up till now.
Yeah, and that is not the world that I want my children to be growing up in. I want so much more for all our children, and for all children to be equal. So, yeah.
And it can happen.
It will happen.
We're getting there.
Might not happen on my timeline, but
yeah. And that's the thing, you know, when the kids do look in their history books, there might even be books then. There might be whatever they have, some kind of, you know, technology, something. When they're looking at the history, what part are we going to be in? You know, are we going to be part of the ones that go, wow, aren't these people amazing? They're trailblazers. They were trying to create something that the world didn't know yet. They didn't know how to do yet. But these people, even though they didn't feel comfortable in it, and they were afraid sometimes, they still did it because they knew that it would bring better for all of us. And now we're enjoying life like we are because of these people who steps out of that comfort zone and we're willing to be vulnerable and we're willing to ask the questions and have the hard conversations. And I really want to encourage people to do it from a space of love, not fear and apprehension. Because if you are coming from that intention of love and inclusion and kindness, that is still felt, even though you may say things that may not be appropriate. But don't do it from fear. You can only bring more fear and apprehension with that.
So beautifully. I just feel like you could just keep talking and we just keep listening and learning.
I know. I'm almost like absolutely mesmerized by it. I'm like, let's keep going.
You just ask my husband. He'll tell you I could talk all day.
That's why my partner said, babe, his podcast.
Well, you know what? I think this is a beautiful spot to leave the conversation for the moment. And you know what? This might be one of those things where Verity and I go away and we process this for a bit, and then we go, Louise, I have more questions.
Yep, that is absolutely fine. It's all about continuing that conversation, growing and expanding, finding where there are things that are within you that you no longer want to hold on to, that you no longer agree with, releasing them. But then we also have to replace them with something better, something you do want within you.
Definitely. And if you do want to keep track of Louise and keep listening to all of her beautiful wisdom and knowledge, you can find her at her website, www.louiseoreilly.com.au. You can also find her on Instagram, louise.o'reilly.shield&conch, CONCH, and also on Twitter, Louise O'Reilly. Is that an O? Is there an O on the end of it, or is it just Louise O'Reilly?
We'll find it. We'll put all the show
notes.
It'll be in the show notes.
But I do have two. So that those ones that you have done is more like following me personally, the things that I'm up to, and it is a lot on my blogging and human rights stuff that I do. So that's mainly that space. But my other space that I do is in my business, which is Ascension Personal Development Academy. And that's where I'm going to be doing the courses where people can come in and learn to unpack these things, learn to have the conversations and learn to have inclusive language. So that's the space. And I mainly do that through Facebook. So if you do actually want to have, I guess, formal learning experiences, that's the place to go. But if you just want to follow me in general, Louise O'Reilly is the place to go.
Beautiful. And you do have a Facebook group as well, Ascension Personal Development. That's the correct name of the group?
No.
Or is it the not. Introduction to Inclusive Language? Where did we find you and source you from?
Yeah, I will. Look, the group that I've got going at the moment is specific to a course. So I'm kind of playing with the idea of what kind of group that I want to have at the moment.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that a lot of people want to be part of a group on how to create inclusion and how to do things. So there may be a new group coming up, or the group that I currently have might transform, but who knows how it goes. Like I said, there's always the right timings, and I have got to wait for the right moment and the right way to do it. And that's all part of that 6 season thing that I was talking about.
And all the more reason to lovingly cyberstalk you.
Absolutely. Do it. I love talking to people, and sometimes it does take me a long time to get back, but I do really value every single comment, and I do always want to come back and show you my appreciation and actually spend some time in giving you a proper comment back. So I really appreciate and value people's patience, but in that, know that always in the back of my mind there is that complete value, the fact that you've taken time to be part of that conversation, to share your comments, to share your thoughts, share your feelings, and I will be back eventually.
Wonderful.
So beautiful. Well, thank you once again, Louise, for jumping on, and no doubt we will be chatting to you again soon.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Hey, if you want to continue this conversation, head over to our Facebook page and be part of the revolution. You can find us at Good Girls Don't Podcast on Facebook. Please note we cannot create change alone. Your support, likes, comments, shares, and iTunes reviews help us to give a voice to the insanely inspirational women and the controversial issues that we discuss.
If you'd like to be a part of our podcast, or if you have an issue that you have a burning desire for us to bring into the light, please contact us. With fierceness, Ashley
and Verity.
Get ready for the rain.